So this topic is leading through weakness, vulnerability, and self-sacrifice. And sometimes we find ourselves in that situation whereby we are not leading from a place of strength. We are not firing on all cylinders. We are looking weak. There's so many things around us that makes us vulnerable. It could be a loss in the family. It could be other things that are happening. It could be a medical situation. It could be over our children, our spouse, that we feel so vulnerable. But even in that vulnerability, we still think and believe that we have to self-sacrifice. And that's how these three are woven together. Now, just like the previous topic, I'm going to use another character in the Bible as our case study for this afternoon. And that person is the Apostle Paul. I was introducing him in the previous lecture. So, what is it about how we lead that makes it so important for us to understand that even when we are not at our best, we can still lead? What makes it important for the congregation that we lead, our family, for them to know that, for them to see our vulnerable side, or for us to be vulnerable with them? And what are the limitations or the boundaries we should have about self-sacrifice? We know the story of Paul. We know how he started. We know that Paul started from a place of prominence. He was a Pharisee. He was well known. He was well lettered. He knew the law, and he had a mandate. And he was like a rising star in the Jewish judiciary. He was one of those young people that say that this guy is a genius. He's gifted, he's talented. But then Paul finds himself on a so-called assignment that he believed that he was doing for God. He found himself he had an encounter. He got arrested. He found himself weak and found himself vulnerable. Someone who had a mandate, who was given authority, now weak. No sight. Now having to depend on others. Now I'm painting this picture, the scriptures you already know. From when you read from Acts chapter 10, you already know. But why am I saying all of this? It's just to pave the way so you understand where Paul is coming from and how that encounter transformed him and how it never left him. But how also it was a mark of his ministry. Now, history has told us fully, it may have been through the many beatings that he had received, that he received some deformity of some nature. Because when you read Galatians, it tells tells us that he said that you saw me in the form of which I am, and you don't despise me. So that means that his affliction was not just eternal, it was something visible that could be seen. But let's come to ministry today. Leadership, how it's seen through the lenses of many people today. Modern leadership emphasizes on strength and control. If you can't control, then that means you're not a good leader. If you're not autocratic, if you don't have power and influence where you can command people, then you are weak. That's what leadership looks like. That's the model that many people understand about leadership. However, my question really is, where did this come from? When you look in the Bible, the only people who displayed such authority were kings. The judges before them didn't. The prophets didn't. The apostles didn't. Jesus never did. So I wonder where that concept came from. So we're going to look at the Pauline leadership style, where he led from weakness, where he led from a place of vulnerability, and where he self-sacrificed again and again. But Jesus said this in Mark chapter 10, from verse 14. He said something along the lines of, whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant. So if you don't know how to serve as a servant, your leadership before Christ is questioned. It needs to be readdressed. It needs to be redefined. Now, this is what we know about Paul. That he led through weakness. And Corinthians, 2 Corinthians chapter 12 tells us the story. And we know the story. And when we read from from verse 9, it says, each time he said, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. Now this is God talking to Paul. So I then asked the question, if God is telling Paul that my power works best in weakness, why do leaders think or believe they need to be strong, powerful, and influential? Why? God was talking to Paul and he said to him, my grace is all you need, or my grace is sufficient for you. My power works best in weakness. And I struggle to understand why some of us feel that we need to be strong, controlling, bossy, and rude to be a leader. I don't understand. So Paul was now saying, so now I am glad to boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ can work through me. Now, if I say only this and sit down, you've got the message. He went on to say, that is why I take pleasure in my weakness and in the insults, hardships, persecutions, and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So weakness became the platform for divine strength. That's how Paul lived out his ministry. Again, remember I said, the humbling experience that Damascus Road taught him. But that lesson never left him because God made him to lead constantly and continuously from a place of weakness. Now, when people see that, when people know that you're not in a strong state, there's something going on, but you are leading. Do you know what that makes you? It makes you authentic because they can see it. And when they see that authenticity in you, it builds confidence. It builds confidence. And when you're in that state of understanding that God's power only manifests when you stay in that weak state, it encourages dependency on God rather than on man. Weakness invites trust and connection to God. In other words, how? It helps us focus on the mission because we know that God is with us. We know that we don't have to put on a show or put on a front or a facade. We can now be ourselves. And it helps the work of ministry to foster. Paul said this in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 3 to 5. He said, I came to you in weakness, timid and trembling. And my message and my preaching were very plain, rather than using clever and persuasive speeches. I relied only on the power of the Holy Spirit. I did this so you would trust not in human wisdom, but in the power of God. So in other words, Paul didn't get to the place and start to show that, yes, I'm the general overseer here. Don't you know who I am? He came in, and we all know Paul's story. He didn't just go to a town or a city or a country. He got there, he found work. He used his hands to work. He didn't rely on them to take care of his needs. They saw him, and he came timid and trembling, the Bible tells us. And he did this so that, he said he relied on the Holy Spirit. In other words, his connection with God. That people may see not the wisdom of man, but the power of God. And what marks what we? I have to bring a good word. I have to bring a powerful word. I have to bring them something that they must do or chant so that they know that I'm the man of God. What didn't sense about that? Paul was willing to show his vulnerability. He didn't hide it. Paul's vulnerability fostered deep connection with the community. His leadership was not about hierarchy, it was about the humbling dependency on God. When we read chapter 12 of 1 Corinthians, we will find it through them. Another thing that I want to bring up here is that Paul was equally under great pressure, just as Moses was. And the pressure that he was under was now from the people, his own people that he used to be part of. They were the ones trying to kill him, trying to arrest him. They were the ones confronting him all the time. They were angry, they were bitter, they were vicious, and they were wicked simply because he changed camp. And then now, imagine Paul, who was one time strong, confident, bold, boasting, creating chaos. His name caused people to tremble. Now Paul is coming and nobody knows. Now the lowly people who are of lower class can sit next to Paul. This angered these priests and these Sadducees, so they were pressurizing him. His status, his identity of what he was before was now lost, and he didn't care. But what we see today is most of us want people to know us, and we're trying to find ways to be recognized. So you know one minister who is prominent, you want to be his friend, you want to be his armor bearer, so that you get known. Right. But that's not what Paul did. He was happy to be vulnerable. He was happy to work with all these people that were not known, the people that were outcasts, people that were down from, people that were overlooked. He was now willing to sit, to eat, and live with them, and share with them. So it's come to a front at the moment that some people are realizing there's actually strength in vulnerability and in weakness. As a matter of fact, it's actually a better leadership model. But isn't that what Jesus did? One or another. We all know the story in John 13. How he washed the feet of his disciples. We know who washed feet in those days. It was slaves. And as a matter of fact, not just any slave, foreigners mostly. Not slaves that were Jewish. Foreign slaves, the ones who washed feet, because it was considered the lowest thing. But Jesus did it. So it's amazing that in the 21st century, people are just realizing it, that, oh, there's power in it. They're now doing serious research, saying that, oh, you know what? So one person there says this. This person, she supports this move and says that this is dynamic, demonstrating that vulnerability is a critical component of trust building and effective leadership. I'm sorry, where were you 2,000 years ago? It's not new. But I'm happy someone is now tracing it back to that time. Because truthfully, leadership in the church has lost its way. And it takes people like you and me to make that change. It's not about the number of the congregation. It's not about the size of the church building. It's not about the car that you ride or the clothes that you wear. It's the lives that you touch. Your clothes, when you die, will be shared or be thrown away. if nobody can wear it. But the lives you touch, they will never forget. Let me say this to us. Do you know that you have to be a very, very good person for you to be remembered 50 years after you are dead? Let me break it down to you. You think it's not true? Right. Think about your grandfather, your grandmother. How many people remember them in your town, your home, your village? And they haven't died 50 years ago. They died probably like 20 or 30 years ago. But who remembers them? You have to be extremely good for not the generation after you, but after to remember you. How many times in the last 1 year have you spoke about your grandfather? You haven't. What does that tell you? So all the noise people are making doesn't make any sense. So rather than chasing after things that don't matter, focus on impacting lives, helping the next generation. Vulnerability, it builds trust, it strengthens relationships, it encourages community. And while we're at it, remember that because you want to be vulnerable, doesn't mean to tell everything that happened to you yesterday. You have to use discretion. You have to use discernment. You have to be constructive in the way you dispense your emotional disclosures. So you have to have that balance between transparency and exposure. So we've talked about weakness, we've talked about vulnerability. Now, here again we see Paul. Paul invested his entire life into ministry, knowing what was going to happen to him. A brother of Jesus, who was going to Jerusalem to be crucified. He was going to Rome, to prison or to die. He was aware of it. And there's so many catalogs of Paul's sacrifice. You see, when he was bitten by a snake, you see how many times he was in prison, you see how many times he was beaten. When he had nothing, when he had something. The question is, have we done that much? Yet we're complaining. So if he went through that much and suffered that much and still believed that through that weakness, through being vulnerable, he has to self-sacrifice, why are we struggling? Why are we saying that not enough? Why are we saying people are chasing anyway? Why are we at that stage? You can lead from a place of vulnerability and weakness, yet you can still say, I am still going to sacrifice everything for the sake of Christ. Because you know that everything you do for Christ, not for self now, everything we do for Christ, everything we do for God, God doesn't forget. And He will reward us in due time. Now, Paul, I read something in preparing this. Paul's leadership style was controversial, was contradictory. That's why they hated him so much. He was, how can you do this? How can you behave like this? How can you say this? And he was bold, even though he was bold and he was courageous. So when we look at, and then something struck me that I read, and I want us to look at, I'm going to do these two scriptures, I'm going to stop. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7, can you put that up for me? Jesus can Paul here compares us to jars of clay, emphasizing of the fact that it's fragile. That's how we are. But why are we complaining? Because we are molded by God in whichever way He wants us to be. So why are we so caught up in trying to design how we should be? And then we now go to 1 Corinthians, same 4 verse 7. And Paul is now talking about how ministry should be. So if you can find that for me and put it up, it would be good. If not, I'll read it. First Corinthians 4:7 says this. What gives you the right to make such a judgment? What do you have that God hasn't given you? And if everything you have is from God, why boast as if it were not a gift? So people like to think that achievements, accolades, what you've acquired is more important than it. But 2 Corinthians 4:7 tells us that, hold on a second, you are just like a jar of clay in God's hands. Everything you achieve, He allows you to achieve. That's where these two verses intertwine. So why do you think that you are deserving or you're honoring than anybody else? Now I want to leave us with this. Paul led from a place of weakness. Weakness can be strength in itself. Vulnerability builds trust. Sacrifice creates impact. Remember these three things. Weakness can be strength. But when we leave from a place of weakness, God's power flourishes. You're giving God the room to flourish and to demonstrate His power. When you are vulnerable, you are authentic, people around you, they will trust you. And I'm not going to go on that because as a team did, talking about when you go to a facade, when things are not working, things are well. Like what he said, it's okay not to be okay. And when you sacrifice, it creates an impact. Every sacrifice you make for the gospel creates an impact. I want us to go away with these 3 points today. And I want us to pray. Can I invite us to rise on our feet?